One of the first research projects I worked on was entitled The Path of the Truth. And the idea behind it was to trace the words of the prophets through the various versions of the Bible that have come to us. And it's an enormous project, which I never published, but I wanted to talk about it because it's very important for, I think, Christians today to understand where the Bible came from. The first writing of the Bible was not by Moses, but it was done by the Yahwist. And people don't really know who that was, but through my research, I found that that was actually King Solomon, who at the first temple wrote down the books of Moses, the Psalms, the songs, and of course the wisdom of Solomon. And he had developed the technique, being the wisest man who ever lived, for producing multiple copies of the Bible. And he had the wherewithal, the means to be able to not just write down one version, but also write down many copies so that they could be given out to the various communities. And one of those went into the Greeks' hands, specifically to Homer, because Homer gained the ability to write his most important works of poetry before he died, and he learned that from Solomon. So he was able to write the Iliad and the Odyssey so that it could be passed down to the generations, not just verbally, but also written. And so if we follow that path of the Old Testament, we find that the book of 70, the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, is the most accurate version of the Old Testament that we have, because the version that went down through the Jewish culture, of course, was exposed to their exile in the city of the devil in Babylon. And that version was rewritten numerous times. So we look at the work of Origen of Alexandria in his Hexapla, where he compared the Old Testament versions next to each other, line by line, phrase by phrase. He confirmed that the Greek version was the one with the least errors and the least omissions compared to all the other versions, the Greek, the Hebrew, and the Aramaic versions. So that made me take a closer look at Greek society. What was it in Greek society that was different than Jewish society? Well, I'm not the only one who did that. Galileo did it. Erwin Schrödinger did it. Many have looked at Greek society to try and understand what was so unique about this culture from the time of Homer to Socrates. Because what came out of that culture is something very Christ-like. We received the Hippocratic Oath, for example, from that culture. We received some of the most beautiful stories from Homer. We got democracy from this culture. We received the Aesop's fables, which is how the Greeks taught their children about morals. plus all of the scientific developments which came out of this culture. Pythagoras, Euclid, Archimedes. And their wisdom has passed the test of time. Things that were written 2,500 to 3,000 years ago are still valid today. And in my lifetime, I can think of many theories which have been overturned during my lifetime. Yet, this culture had something special. And not only special from a wisdom side, but also from a spiritual side. Because if you read the works of Plato and listen to Socrates, he speaks very much like Jesus spoke. And what we find when we look at the developments after Jesus died is the first Christians were descendants of this culture. They were the Greek towns that Paul went to speak to. And they were ready for the coming of Jesus, the coming of the Logos. They were waiting for him. The Jews are still waiting for him. But the Greeks, not all of them, the ones descended from the enlightened culture, the Ionian culture, they were ready for Jesus to come. And this story of the three wise men coming from the Orient, they were also descendants of this culture. They knew he was coming, and they came to greet him. So when you look at the early Christian scholars, they weren't simple people like the disciples were. They were highly educated, graduates of Alexandria and of the school of Plato. They were well versed in the languages, in the teachings of Platonism. And so when Origen of Alexandria did his 50 years of teaching, he used the scientific method to teach about Christianity and to reconcile Christianity with logic, with Platonism, with Judaism, and to be the only scholar ever to use the scientific method on the Old Testament by laying them out side by side and discovering the errors and omissions that exist in the various versions of the Old Testament, the Torah, for example. So for 300 years after Origen, his teachings spread throughout Europe and Asia. His teachings of restoration, the loving teachings of Jesus. But that didn't fit with the Roman Empire, these loving teachings. And so the Emperor Justinian declared the greatest, most prolific biblical scholar who ever lived, declared him a heretic, and his teachings were destroyed. And he committed genocide on all the people who believed in his teachings. That's what the Roman Catholic Church is built upon. It's built upon genocide. It's built upon rejecting logic, because what they did is they rejected Platonism. They rejected Socrates. They rejected Euclid, Pythagoras. They rejected it all. And of course, it wasn't until Galileo where a part of that was ripped away from the church. And I mentioned Erwin Schrödinger also, when he saw how science had become so pig-headed, so thinking that they knew everything. He went back in history to figure out, where did they go wrong? How did they miss this very simple quantum physics idea? And he went back and found that the church had ripped apart spirituality from science. And how can you understand the creation of God without understanding his creation, without understanding the laws that govern this wonderful world that we live in? Because it is the spiritual laws that were used to create these material laws. And that's what the enlightened Greeks knew. That's why their theories have lasted millennia, because they understood the underlying laws, underlying the physical laws. And that's what philosophy meant back then. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. And you can only gain wisdom, according to the founders of philosophy, through logic, reason, and a knowledge of the physical laws. So that anything that you theorize fits within the laws that exist in nature. And Einstein talked about that during his life, because he said, the natural laws are simple, they're elegant, they're wise, they're not complicated. And that's why he didn't like quantum theory, because it didn't reflect nature. And it still doesn't. But that's another story. The point is that the early Christians were descendants of this great culture who honored women, who created the medical community. And that's something that we need to get back to as Christians, if we want to be Christ-like. Christianity is not defined by what church you go to. It's defined by walking in the footsteps of Jesus Christ and loving our neighbors and loving our enemies and caring for the poor and caring for the sick. That's what Christianity is all about. Not the man-made doctrines created by imperialistic rulers. That's not what Christianity is.